The period of the good emperors is often regarded as the high point of Roman stability and prosperity, spanning 96 to 180 AD. This era, described by English historian Edward Gibbon as a time when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, was certainly the highlight reel of Roman effectiveness. The five good emperors began with Nerva, a compromise candidate after Empress Domitian's assassination, who stabilized the empire and began adoptive succession by naming a competent heir, Trajan. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest extent through Dacian and Parthian conquests, funding monumental projects with his newfound wealth. Then Hadrian consolidated the empire by withdrawing from Mesopotamia, building walls, and promoting Hellenistic culture. After Hadrian, Antonius Pius maintained peace and fiscal stability, and finally Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic philosopher, defended the empire against Germanic invasions and the Antonine Plague. But his choice of Commodus as a successor broke the adoptive tradition, setting the stage for instability. Beginning with the assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 AD, the empire fell over 25 emperors in just 50 years, compounded by invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse. The barracks emperors, as they were called, of this period relied on military loyalty, leading to short reigns and constant usurpations. Food insecurity was also a persistent challenge during this time, as it was throughout most of the history of the Roman Empire, particularly in the city of Rome itself, which relied on a very complex supply chain, a lot of that originating from Egypt, in order to feed its population, which some estimates suggest might have been approaching 1 million at this point. The empire was overly dependent on grain from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, distributed through the annona, a state-subsidized system providing free or cheap grain to citizens. This system was susceptible to disruptions like piracy, drought, or, as in the 3rd century crisis, instability and rogue generals. Food shortages sparked unrest, as seen even before the crisis of the 3rd century, when, under Nero, grain shortages led to riots. Emperors were thus forced to prioritize Rome's food supply to maintain political stability, often at the expense of some of the border provinces when food was more important than defense. Eventually, Diocletian came up with a response to the 3rd century crisis, recognizing that one emperor could not govern the vast Roman Empire. Diocletian divided power. In 285 AD, he appointed Maximian as co-Augustus, with Diocletian ruling the east and Maximian the west. In 293 AD, he further delegated authority by naming two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, creating a four-man rule, or tetrarchy. Diocletian reorganized the empire into smaller provinces grouped into dioceses. He separated military and civilian authority to prevent rebellions. He doubled the army's size, and he fortified the frontiers. The Tetrarchy temporarily restored order, but its reliance on cooperation among the four Caesars proved unsustainable, along with inflexible succession planning, ambition, and rivalries, which were all a product of the Tetrarchy. Eventually, the division of the Roman Empire into eastern and western halves became permanent by the late 4th century, driven by simple necessity. Thereafter, Western Rome was overrun by powerful European kingdoms that arose from the various Gothic, Gallic, and Germanic tribes. And thus, in 476 AD, Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor of the West, was deposed and pardoned by the German chieftain Odoacer. But what if we gave Rome an interesting buff? What if Rome was given the potato? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Subper, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, James Cravero, Alfonso Maurice, Sebastian, and Atomical Mon Studios 2. Thank you, and enjoy the video. But before we can even get into the video, we actually have to give a special thanks to our sponsor, World of Warship's Legends. I'm sure you've heard all about him, the massive, free-to-play MMO with some of the most realistic ships of any game out there. But now World of Warships Legends has just expanded, much like Tiberius, beyond just PvP with the rollout of War Tales. War Tales will take you through story-driven missions where you can test and refine your strategic skills and the plethora of ships available to choose from. You'll be able to find the strategy and play style that suits you, whether you end up going single player or multiplayer. All new players will also receive the premium battleship Arkansas, the Karlsruhe Cruiser, a German model, 7 days of premium membership, 5 loot crates, and 2 sets of 10 camouflage kits to make your ship stand out or blend in. The choice is yours. It's truly like being an Admiral von Tippets in a candy store, if the candy store looked suspiciously like an A-list video game. Click the link below to start playing from the comfort of your own home, whether on a PlayStation or an Xbox, and join some 8 million players already warring and shipping and doing other warship-related things of that nature. Again, if you click the link below, you'll receive a premium battleship, cruiser, 1 week of premium, 5 loot crates, and 2 sets of 10 camo kits. Once again, thank you to World of Warships Legends for their generous sponsorship, and now let's get back to Rome. So let's imagine that in the 2nd century AD, at the height of Rome's golden age under the good emperors, the potato mysteriously shows up in the Eternal City. The first question becomes, would the Romans actually adopt the potato? By this point, wheat was the lifeblood of Roman society, literally subsidized by the state to keep the plebs fed and docile, much like rice in the Chinese empires. There were other sources of food as well, but they weren't quite as dignified. Barley was used pretty much only for slaves, as noted by the historian Polybius. Oats weren't very culturally acceptable, as they were associated with barbarian tribes like the Germans. The Romans were actually quite strict about their rigid food hierarchy. It was very deeply ingrained, no pun intended, in a cultural fixation on what was Roman. So now imagine some strange knobby root shows up, completely foreign in look, taste, and most damningly origin. It doesn't look like a grain, it doesn't grow like a grain, it really doesn't look like civilized food at all, and it comes from underground, which in Roman cosmology is where all things impure or chthonic belong. You'd have farmers suspicious and aristocrats uninterested. After all, culinary prestige in Rome was tied to tradition and hierarchy, not really innovation. Much like how oats would later nourish the Scots while being scoffed at by the English, the potato would have probably been dismissed by Rome's upper crust as the stuff of rustic barbarians, or worse, fit only for livestock. And since attitude towards food changes at a glacial pace, especially in societies where class and cuisine are tightly interwoven, it's unlikely the potato would find any meaningful foothold in the empire. Nutritionally revolutionary, sure, but culturally, Rome just wasn't ready. But that's no fun, so perhaps we ought to qualify our hypothetical a little bit. Let's say that, for whatever reason, the potato was introduced to Rome in the 2nd century AD and became a widely adopted food source among all classes, starting from the city and spreading along the countryside of the Italian peninsula. Once the poor start eating it and the benefits become undeniable, the stigma might fade just enough for adoption to creep up the social ladder. After all, even Romans eventually took to dormice and fermented fish sauce. Stranger things have happened. Now let's talk geography and agriculture. The Italian peninsula isn't ideal for every crop, but it's hardly inhospitable to potatoes. The volcanic soils of Campania, fertile. The temperate climate of Etruria, manageable. The mountainous interior, though, would be less suited. For serious, scalable production, the real boon would come from outside Italy. Southern Gaul would be quite perfect. Mild winters, rich soils, and well-established infrastructure of Roman villas and farming estates. It's not hard to imagine southern Gaul becoming the empire's potato basket, feeding both Roman Italy and key military garrisons along the Rhine. But here's the twist. The potato changes the demographic game. Potatoes are a caloric powerhouse, way more so than wheat. Historically, they fueled population surges in places like Ireland and the Andes, where yields per acre were simply incredible. In 18th century Ireland, for instance, a single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a whole year, compared to, of course, wheat's far leaner output. Though this does kind of assume immediate large-scale cultivation. Now, potatoes are also vulnerable to disease without clonal variety, so we could see a late blight or rot. Not fatal, but another setback. Regardless, if widely adopted across Italy and southern Gaul, we would definitely see a steady uptick in urban populations in Romanized areas, especially in the Central and Western Empire. Grain dependence once limited how many mouths could be fed from a single estate, but now with potatoes in the mix, the limits are far higher. Italy could come on par with the more wheat-reliant provinces in the east, Egypt, Anatolia, and Syria, in terms of population and per capita food security, if not sheer volume. It would be a complement that would keep the West politically relevant more so than it had been around this time, when the East continued to dictate a lot of the affairs of the empire given the integration of Gaul, and the focus that brought away from the West. But there is a catch. Food surpluses don't always equal imperial strength. If potato cultivation becomes centralized in Gaul, it might draw wealth and importance away from Rome, and further, Egypt and Sicily. Though the East is much more likely to remain its own entity, as it kind of was around this time anyway. Those rural Gallic estates, already semi-Romanized, would become more critical to imperial logistics. Maybe they start supplying more food to frontier legions, giving those provincial governors and aristocrats more political leverage if they don't like the direction the emperor is taking in Rome. But even more damning, with the precious potato being cultivated in what was essentially a frontier land in Gaul, it gives the opportunity for the Roman Empire to lose the monopoly over this crop quite quickly, before it could perhaps capitalize on the societal benefits. The Frisi, the Batavians, or even the Suebi might end up stealing potatoes, planting them in the damp, fertile soil of the Netherlands and northern Germany, and lo and behold, they would start their own quiet agricultural revolution, which could foster a population boom in these regions. The damp, temperate climate of northern Europe, much like Ireland's, suits potatoes splendidly. Some of these German tribes, already scratching out a living with barley and cattle, would find potatoes a low-effort, high-reward crop. No need for complex irrigation or terracing, just stick them in the ground and wait. Historical precedent backs this. When potatoes reached Europe in the 16th century, they spread fastest in marginal lands where grains struggled, like the Scottish Highlands or Prussia's very sandy soils. And further, by the 2nd century AD, these Germanic tribes were semi-sedentary, with enough agricultural know-how, which we know from Tacitus's Germania, to adopt a new crop if it proved its worth. If potatoes were thus introduced across the Rhine, for whatever reason, adaptation could take hold within a generation, say 20 to 30 years, especially if tribal leaders see bigger harvests and healthier warriors. Now, what does a potato-fueled population boom look like in Germania? More mouths, for starters. A tribe like the Batavians, which historically capped at perhaps 30 to 40,000, might double in size over a century. Obviously take the numbers with a grain of salt, but you get the idea. More people mean more warriors, more labor, and more pressure on the land. And more pressure on the land means Germanic society, which was loosely organized around kinship and war bands, again per Tacitus, would likely see larger and more cohesive tribal confederations, but more so the need to expand and conquer more land in order to sustain these larger populations. Now, as we know, the agricultural revolution, again, does produce sort of more civilized, more centralized societies. The Marcomanni under Maroboduus in the 1st century AD showed how a charismatic leader could unify Germanic tribes, and potatoes could amplify this, giving chiefs the surplus to feed bigger retinues. But population growth, again, doesn't automatically mean state building, of course. The Germans lacked the bureaucratic traditions of Rome or even the Gauls. Instead, we'd probably see just far larger raids on Gaul and Roman territories, and some migrations as surplus young men, armed and restless, push against Roman frontiers. Essentially a force almost the size of the Goths in the 4th century, swollen by agricultural gains and climate pressures, would, after some time, cause a ton of trouble for the Romans. Now, Trajan will be dead by 117 AD, so Hadrian will likely reign focusing on consolidation rather than expansion during this time. His wall-building obsession suggests he doubled down on fortifications if these Germanic raids spiked with this population growth. Maybe major upgrades to the limes Germanicos, more watchtowers, more men, more reinforcement. Potatoes wouldn't change Hadrian's temperament, he'd still avoid big wars, but by Antonius Pius's reign, a larger Germanic population might force more skirmishes. That said, however, we could also see, and this is a completely different train of thought than what we've been tackling before, we could also see potatoes make Germanic lands less marginal, and that might mean they become less dependent on raiding. That's a real twist. Rome might have fewer invasions, but stronger, yet civilized, sedentary neighbors over time who would be more apt to harsh Germanic diplomacy rather than raids on Gaul. Now, Antonius Pius historically kept the peace, while his legions crushed rebellions in Britain and Judea. If the Batavians, say, leveraged potato surpluses to revolt, as they'd already revolted in 69 to 70 under Civilis, Antonius might face a nastier fight. Extra food means better supplied insurgents, dragging out campaigns and straining Rome's coffers. I think we'd see Marcus Aurelius find battling the Marcomanni in the Marcomannic Wars less of a brutal slog, as the potato-fed Romans would be going up against a Marcomanni confederation which, logistically, probably wouldn't have acquired or thoroughly cultivated the potato yet. The spread of new crops, like millet in ancient China or maize in post-Columbian Africa, took centuries due to geographic barriers, social conservatism, and even uneven trade networks. And the Marcomanni, centered in Bohemia, were farther from Roman trade routes along the Rhine, where potatoes would first cross into Germania, as we've seen with the amber trade patterns, which again, thanks to Tacitus, we know of. But let's get a bit more abstract. We've been focusing on kind of petty squabbles. What about Roman society and the military? If potatoes take off in Gaul and Italy, as we've posited, the legions will of course benefit. Potatoes store well, better than grain in damp conditions, and could be stockpiled in forts or carried on campaigns. A legionary's daily 3,000 calories, which was historically tied to wheat porridge and bread, could partially be shifted to boiled or roasted potatoes, which furthermore were easier to prep in the field. Smaller plots could support retired veterans, as an acre of potatoes yields 10 to 20 tons versus 1 to 2 tons for wheat, and about an equal ratio for calories per acre, so a veteran's land granted Gaul wouldn't need to be as large to support his estate, allowing for more room for the inevitably larger Roman population. Now the big one. Does the crisis of the 3rd century still happen, and how does it change? The crisis was a perfect storm. We had economic collapse, we had invasions, we had civil wars, we had plague. And potatoes tweak the equation, but they certainly don't rewrite it. On Rome's side, better food security in Gaul and Italy could mean denser urban populations and more tax revenue, which might cushion the economic blows. Gaul's potato estates could also keep legions fed when Egypt's grain shipments falter, as they did during Aurelian's reign, but decentralization is a big problem. If Gaul becomes the Western Empire's breadbasket or potato basket, its governors, as alluded to, gain a ton of political leverage, and historically, Gauls just up and left the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. They formed the Gallic Empire, which lasted from 260 to 274 AD under Postumus. Thus, a potato-rich Gaul, which has more political leverage and which might not want to tie itself to this economically crippled Rome, means that Rome probably will lose its potato supply when Gaul inevitably secedes. And with grain shipments from Egypt all but halted, this is going to be disastrous. Across the Rhine, a beefier Germania could also complicate things. By 235 AD, a century of potato growth could mean tribes like the Alemanni would be able to field 20 to 30,000 warriors instead of just 10,000, overwhelming the frontier garrisons as they take advantage of a weakened Rome. The Gothic invasions of the 250s AD, which sacked cities like Athens, suggest what's possible. Now imagine this, but with triple the invasion force. The crisis will hit. Rome's structural flaws, over-reliance on the emperors, bloated armies, debased currency, will almost be compounded. Eventually, with the loss of Egypt, Rome will fall into catastrophe. Consider the precedent of Diocletian's Annona Militaris, a military grain tax in kind. If Rome is already leaning heavily on the Gallic potato for its legions by the mid-3rd century, then a breakaway Gallic empire would not only deprive Rome of a major food source for its larger population, it would force the central government to scramble for replacements, either by increasing levels from Spain and North Africa, or by attempting to militarize agricultural production more aggressively in the remaining loyal provinces. And this accelerates what was already happening in our own history, a shift toward a command economy, heavier rural taxation, and more localized provisioning, sort of a proto-feudalism. In our timeline, Diocletian and later Constantine reorganized the empire into the dioceses, reformed tax systems, and tied peasants to the land, the coloni. In this timeline, with Gaul and its potato power unavailable to Rome, those reforms are probably going to come faster and more brutally, perhaps even under Gallienus or Claudius Gothicus rather than Diocletian. You get early versions of the later feudal economy, proto-manorial estates, more autarkic military zones, and a ruralization of both imperial administration and elite life. The eastern half of the empire may look on with a mix of indifference and opportunism. Egypt, Anatolia, and Syria were already always more self-sufficient, and they of course would be less invested in the potato economy. Under rulers like Odaenathus and later Zenobia of Palmyra, we could see an east-west split or something of a tetrarchy way faster than in our own history. Zenobia, in real history of course, seized Egypt and challenged Rome directly. Now, Palmyra's ability to dominate trade routes and food exports could tip the balance toward a permanent split this early on. We might imagine the Palmyrene Empire becoming a viable rival state, not just a transient rebel regime, bolstered by stronger Egyptian loyalty and Eastern commercial wealth from the Silk Road. All that said, we're looking at a serious disaster for Rome. The Western Caesar might be reduced to managing Italy, Spain, and Africa, with limited reach into Gaul. The Eastern Augustus might focus on shoring up Anatolia and the Levant, while the Gauls would continue to fight with the West, and Egypt would have incredible influence over imperial politics in the East. Perhaps Rome could uproot the Gallic Empire and reassert control, but Gaul would still have a tight grip over the Western Augustus. It's simply an unsustainable situation. By the early to mid-400s AD, the West will probably be unraveling. A lost cause. Whatever is left of the Gallic Empire, which undoubtedly would have fractured into smaller states over time, and Italian Rome, will probably be viable for a little longer than in our own history, with Rome proper living on as a regional power past 500 AD. Gaul, though, is going to be a real story. It's a hybrid zone, Romano-Gallic elites running what we might consider proto-feudal potato estates, while the rise of Frankish kingdoms like Clovis's would still occur, seeing them adopt Roman titles and probably potato agriculture. Think Merovingian France, but earlier and richer, and sort of with some pre-existing imperial heritage to inherit from the Gallic Empire. The East would be thriving under Justinian, though his conquests might skip an Italy that's still somewhat intact entirely, focusing instead on Persia. By 550 AD, the West wouldn't necessarily have fallen, but would have been transformed, reduced almost. Italy will be a patchwork of city-states loyal to quote-unquote Rome. Gauls, a Frankish Gallic powerhouse, and Germania's tribes would be settling in. Potatoes, unfortunately, didn't save Rome, but they made its twilight brighter and its successors sturdier, so to speak. The empire, as we knew it, would be gone, but from its ashes will sprout a potato-fed medieval world. A renaissance, perhaps. A well-fed Christendom, prepared, once it's self-repaired, to face any threats that might arrive from the East. Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it for now. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed the video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the Use of Z, signing out.